Welcome to the panel, Do They Need to Get It Right? What's right and wrong with cinema sci-fi? And we have people here who are both practitioners and expert observers of this subject. From my right, your right, to your left, we have Jennifer Ouellette, who is a writer. Her books are on sale. I assume they're all gone by now, Jennifer. But, yeah.
There's still a couple.
There's still a couple. Here's your chance. And also the National Academy of Sciences woman on the spot in Tinseltown, hooking up producers of sci-fi films with scientists. Next to Jennifer is Paul Duffield, who is an artist. He says a comic artist. But is it manga or what sort of art?
Manga influence.
Manga influence, yeah.
Manga is just the Japanese word for comics, so.
Oh. It's just a Department of Redundancy department. Yeah. And Paul lives in Oxford, in the UK, and as I've mentioned before, Paul is responsible for the art on your badges and throughout this conference. So, give me a hand for that. And to Paul's right is Kevin Grazier. He's a research scientist for Cassini at the Jet Propulsion Lab, and he's also an advisor for the films Battlestar Galactica and Eureka. Great following there. And he mentions to me, but he didn't really want me to tell you this, but I will anyhow, that his book, The Science of Battlestar Galactica, will be coming out this fall. And that's Tim Russ. Are you?
I just was saying goodbye.
Oh, I thought maybe you were on this panel. You're not going to Vulcan, are you?
No, that bus left right here.
Okay.
I just want to say goodbye. Thank you for having me.
Boundless talents. Okay, I'm going to get out of this. We're going to start with a little 5-minute exposition from each of the panelists, as is the de rigueur here, after which they get the chance to rebut one another if they care to do so, after which we open it to you to grill them. So let's begin with Kevin.
I'm not sure I've got 5 minutes worth of intro to make you suffer through, but you know, I am a research scientist. I do work as a scientist for my day job, and anything I do in the entertainment industry is on the side, part-time. It's been satisfying that the shows like Battlestar Galactica and Eureka actually have a science advisor and one to whom they'll listen. But that's a trend that's happening increasingly often, but it's actually not been the trend in the past. I don't know about you, but there's been several cringeworthy moments in some of my favorite sci-fi series and movies. The TARDIS touring the Earth, no, I just can't get over that, I'm sorry. Anyway, so, yeah, well, apparently. So it's satisfying to me that people are actually trying to get science right, and when I got a job on Battlestar Galactica, I looked at it as, yes, this is fun, yes, this is cool, yes, there'll be a lot of cool perks coming from this, but I'm also a scientist and science educator at the same time. I do a lot of public outreach, and I knew that for years beyond this, that I would be that Battlestar Galactica guy, and here's an opportunity for many teachable moments. There's the book coming out, The Science of Battlestar, that discusses the science to which we alluded in the show. But it's actually had some pretty tangible benefits as far as teaching K-12 students, especially like 7th and 8th graders who are too cool for science. And I've said this story before, but there have been several instances where I've been trying to talk to a class, and usually there's students who are old enough to know what BSG is, Battlestar Galactica is, old enough to know what implications of working in Hollywood. And I've actually had situations where I have gone to a class, and normally the topics about which I speak are compelling enough. I talk about Cassini, the bones of life in the outer solar system, the importance of water, things of that nature. And usually that's compelling enough that students who may or may not normally listen will perk up and pay an interest. But still, there's occasionally that guy. And having worked on Battlestar has provided me an opportunity that I've had students in classes to whom I've been speaking. They will sit there and they'll actually pay attention. Students who wouldn't normally pay attention, usually this guy, will pay attention and they'll be engaged and they'll be focused, if for no other reason, that at the end of the talk, when it's time for Q&A, They can say, yes, do you know Trisha Helfer? Anyway. So it's a two-edged sword here that we, by getting science into sci-fi, which I think is important, I mean real science, instead of we only use 10% of our brain science. That's a common misnomer that sci-fi quotes again and again and again. That might encourage people to look it up and say, hey, is that really true? And then maybe they'll teach themselves something. And at the same time, it helps me as an educator get an in with people perhaps I wouldn't normally have an in with. So I think, yes, it's definitely important to get it right as much as you dramatically can. We're still storytellers after all. Okay, maybe I did go over 5 minutes, but take it away.
Okay, I'm gonna pick up on something you mentioned tangentially and use the TARDIS as a metaphor.
British.
Yeah, not British. I'm not actually a great Doctor Who fan, don't tell me. Okay, so the TARDIS, it's a piece of technology, but essentially it's a magic box. It can do anything. And Doctor Who is very much like this. It writes itself into all sorts of crazy corners because the TARDIS can do anything and Doctor Who can do pretty much everything.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Oh, sorry. Is that better? Okay, sorry about that. And this is, you know, I'm not putting Doctor Who down for this. I'm primarily not a scientist. I'm a kind of comic artist and writer myself. So there's this conjunction where science and writing meet, and the methods of science don't fit into the way that people tend to tell stories very well. The methods of science are slow, they do not produce definite results every single time. They are skeptical. They don't make fast, powerful television. They don't make you know, they are the thing behind the magic, not the magic itself. And so it's about, I think, addressing this sort of conjunction between science and science fiction and science and any type of writing. It's about trying to distill the essence of the scientific method whilst getting over that hurdle of telling a decent story in an hour and 20 minutes or however long it is that you've got. And it's a huge challenge, one that I've thankfully not had to face myself yet. But I think it's amazing that people like Kevin and people like Jennifer are kind of getting in there and trying to find practical ways to get around this challenge and to get our entertainment reflecting the richness of science and the things that it can kind of add to entertainment. So, by the way, this is all off the spur at the moment because I'm standing in for is it Andre Bormanis? Yeah. So I'm making this up on the spot. Yeah. So that I think kind of in terms of sort of a beginning of a discussion, I think practical questions are going to revolve around what parts of science have to be left on the cutting floor, and what parts of science can remain in entertainment, and why, and what that does to people, and whether the message has really been put across.
This isn't going to be a boring panel if we don't disagree. I get asked this question a lot. I have been working with Hollywood for the last 2 years through the Science Entertainment Exchange, and I get different reactions. And one of them is by people who love science fiction movies the way they are. They kind of like the cheesiness. You know, they're like, we love, you know, ripping apart the bad science in movies, and you're spoiling our fun. If they start getting it right, what are we going to, like, complain about?
They complain when you get it right.
Yeah. I told there will always be complainers. But I always emphasize that this is not about being the accuracy police, because as both of these guys, you know, have pointed out, it's all about the story, and there's just certain things about science that do not translate well in a narrative element. Nobody wants to sit around and wait for 2 weeks for DNA results to come back on CSI, so you end up getting it by the end of the episode. That kind of time compression. What we're getting is the montage. You know, and let's face it, we would love our lives to be, if our lives, our daily life was gonna be presented on a television show, we would, believe me, want the montage. There's certain things you don't want depicted. Like how you look in the morning before your coffee. So Hollywood does that. That's part of good storytelling. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that getting the science right isn't important. It just means that it's not of paramount importance. And as Paul said, you have to kind of use your own judgment to pick and choose which parts get left on the cutting room floor. There are some places that we've certainly found where a writer needed to get from plot point A to plot point B, and he had this idea of how he might do it scientifically. It would be a science sort of thing. He'd done a little bit of Googling, read a couple of articles in New Scientist, and he thought this might work. We put him in a room with a scientist. The scientist says, well, no, actually that's not going to work. But there's this other bit of research that perhaps you didn't know about that will actually accomplish the same thing, be scientifically accurate, it will give you a kind of new and interesting twist to your story, and you can actually do something really fun and different that you might not have encountered before. It's those moments that I think we want to focus on. Rather than being sticklers for accuracy and fact and making, there's no sound in space, whatever. I know it bugs Kevin, it drives him nuts. But we're telling a story, and I think you can still use those moments as a teaching moment. When you give talks, when you go to students, you could say, oh look, you could hear the explosion, and that just so wouldn't happen, and here's why. And they'll remember that. But it doesn't spoil their fun either, they can still appreciate the movie. Where I think we can really have the biggest impact is in using science in very creative ways to enhance the storytelling process, and the only way you find those is by in-depth interactions between writers in Hollywood and the scientists. So that's what we do.
All right. Did the panel wish to berate one another?
No.
There are no explosions in space either.
Yes. Oh well. I wouldn't go that far.
Okay. By the way, Kevin has to leave.
Yeah, I have to leave it for a flight, so in half an hour, so I'll be leaving a little early.
Just in case you think he's leaving some sort of protest. Right? Okay. Well, then, in that case, I think that it's time to get the energy going by having you grill the panel with your questions. So, those of you who have questions, this gentleman right here in the front.
Well, I just kind of jump on there. The teachable moments. I'm a physics teacher in high school, and like my favorite thing is in 2001 to calculate the artificial gravity of the space station, which is depicted wrong in 2001. But the kids love that, that it's wrong, and it's cool, So we can actually do that and count the motion of the space station and everything. They really dig that, and it's wrong.
On a related note, the comment was that the spin rate of the space station in 2001 was wrong. So it's not mostly high, right, or low?
It's high, yeah.
High, okay.
It's high.
And on a related note, I actually did a calculation for Zephyr. Zephyr is the ring ship in Battlestar Galactica, the one with the spinning ring for gravity. And I did the calculation in the book. Or for the book, and it turns out that I was convinced at one point that the special effects people did the calculation and depicted it correctly, and then I found later on we just kind of put it where we thought it should be. So it was kind of serendipitous. but yeah, based on some size estimates that I made, background, yeah, they seem to be spinning at a pretty good rate. Excuse me.
Okay, other questions? By the way, I'm told that if you spin more than once per minute, everybody gets nauseous from the Coriolis.
Yeah, pretty much. About three RPMs, and most people are nauseous. 6 RPMs, everybody's nauseous.
Well, it's good. You might as well make it democratic. Have everybody.
Yeah, there you go.
Do you mind if I interject quickly here?
Oh, yeah.
Just something that popped up here is this idea of having to match calculations and science to pre-existing imagery, because this is one of the things that happens a lot in producing movies, is that the concept art's already done, the story's already created, or that sequence has already been shipped off to Framestore to do the special effects, and in the end it's the artists who have to, on a crazy deadline, think, oh God, is this the right rate of spin, or is this an accurate space helmet, or would this person actually do this in space? And the emphasis, or rather the pressure, ends up being on a large group of designers who just have enthusiasm to go on So that's a big kind of pitfall in the market.
Yeah, I kind of want to just expound on that even just a tiny bit more. I mean, in my initial comments, I kind of focused on the writer, but of course, we also work very closely with art directors on Watchmen, for instance, because you're dealing with a visual medium here, and what it looks like. Sometimes the scientific expertise doesn't ever come across in the script, but it's everywhere when you look at the designs. And you need to remember that, about Hollywood, that sometimes the clues are in the visual aspect and not necessarily in the verbal.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I think if you got the science right, you wouldn't have any science fiction movies that would be worth going to. I think one of my favorite science fiction movie was Alien. And at the beginning they got that right because there's, in space nobody can hear you scream. And I also thought it was brilliant, not just because of the physics or incorrect physics to do with their artificial gravity and so on, but also the ingenious way in which they had a biological life form. My background is more in molecular biology, and I thought it was absolutely amazing how they created this creature from the egg that went inside somebody's body and then came out of their mouth and grew amazingly quickly into this incredible monster. It's just a fantastic movie, in my opinion. My second favorite was Contact, but anyway, that's... anyway, I think if you get the science right, you don't have such an interesting story.
So your question is, is it a good policy to get the science right? Is that what you're saying?
Sometimes, yes.
Well, I think you can, any science fiction show has a few conceits where, if you go with us that we're going to get this wrong, then, we'll stick with the rest of our established universe. And like, again, example I use is on Battlestar, artificial gravity. You're going to have to assume that, or else somebody who took me to task for that, under getting it right, said, I told them, Edward James Olmos, Mary McDonald, pick one of those who is not going to be in the show because we're going to simulate zero-G environment, because that's what's going to cost. So pick one of our main stars that we're going to, whose salary will pay for the. So there's something that you just, for dramatic reasons or for budgetary reasons, artificial gravity is an assumption. FTL travel. If we don't have FTL travel, we're not going to visit another planet in our lifetimes, and we're looking for a home. So you have to find some way to get from point A to point B other than in real time. And then Sound in Space, and actually the original series Bible, and I think that's something that's kind of more unique to just the more sci-fi shows, is they have what's called a Bible, a document that says, here's our story, here are our characters, here's our tech, etc. And it lays out things in advance, and I think sci-fi is kind of on the cutting edge of doing that more than perhaps other shows, or other genres. And in our original Bible, it said there's going to be no sound in space. And I don't know where that and Galactica entered into the process, but certainly it's muted, and that's a conscious choice. So, but beyond those, once you get beyond those, the point I actually intended to make was that once you get beyond those, the science in our show is pretty good across the board. I mean, there's a few things that kind of, but I never felt that I wasn't listened to, and again, even when people have kind of picked nits at some of the stuff that the nitpicking is, the nitpickers are wrong. So I mean, it's actually, we did a pretty good job of telling a pretty compelling story, because it's not about the sci-tech, it's about the people. It's a character-driven story. And when you deal with the characters, if point I've made like several times over this weekend even, is that if you were to describe my day, just today, to somebody in the 1960s, this is magic. My iPhone, and this is sci-fi. So just by describing these people's days, and we're on a spaceship and in space, there's going to be scientific elements that we can get right, and that's what the bulk of it was. It was establishing the technology, the sci-tech of this culture, and that's continuing on with Caprica. And similar vein, they're doing as right as they can. And I think we can tell compelling stories and get it right overwhelmingly the majority of the time.
Yeah, I totally agree.
But what about, Kevin, what about the questioner's point? Right. That getting it all right may interfere with good sci-fi?
Well, let's say, for example, you watch a piece of drama. It's not science fiction. It just deals with the real world. Technically, all the science in it is accurate. It's just a depiction of the real world. No science enters into it. The technology actually exists. All of these things actually happen. People really act that way. Ultimately, like you said, it's about the people in the story, not necessarily about the science. And the more I think it's more about not whether the science is accurate or not, but a kind of a ratio. You can't have a story that just consists of scientific information or scientific technology doing things or being in a plot. You need the characters to have that kind of compelling aspect of the story. And so, regardless of whether the science is accurate or not, it just needs to not overwhelm the storytelling and the characters. I think that's the most important aspect of the storytelling.
And I was going to say, Sid Perkowitz wrote a book called Hollywood Science, and he watched all these like classic sci-fi films, and he said there was one where they really, when they set out to make it, they said, we're going to make this as scientifically accurate as possible. And he said it was the most boring, god-awful movie he had ever seen. But it was scientifically accurate. So there is something to your point. But I think what we're all saying is when it's done right, when you don't let the science and tech obsession interfere with actually telling a story, not when it doesn't get in the way, when you have the appropriate ratio between, really focused on the characters and the science is in service to the story, then you've got the best of both worlds and you've got an incredibly powerful medium.
That had the Borg in it.
That's Star Trek. No, and in relation to what Seth asked, okay, let me use a different example. Something else I've worked on is called virtuality. Has anybody actually seen virtuality? Okay, one person, and there's a reason for that, because it was a Fox commissioned a show, and it was done by some of the Battlestar people. I worked on it. Michael Taylor wrote the script for it. Ron Moore was executive producer. Ron and Michael we produced virtuality, and Fox ended up not liking it, and they showed the pilot on the Friday before 4th of July last summer. So it was slated for you not to have seen it, so there's no groundswell of uprising, of protest when they don't pick it up. See? It had horrible ratings. Of course it had horrible ratings. It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. But anyway, in virtuality, the science was still better than even Galactica. I mean, it was about a spacecraft. It was en route to Epsilon Eridani, because there's potential for intelligent life there. That's when we've sussed that from our probes, or our telescopes. And the spacecraft, Phaeton, it was... we pick up, we're approaching Neptune. Neptune's our go, no-go point. You aim one side of Neptune, you gravity assist, you slingshot, and you light off the Orion drive, and off you go to, at high relativistic speed, not faster than light. And we actually calculated the trip time to Eridani and back. So the relativity was honored in this, which is how often does that happen? And also the notion of a gravity assist around Neptune. That was our go, no-go point. If it's a no-go, we actually target a different point, a different aim point around Neptune and go back to Earth. And the ship had a spinning section for gravity. The science was even better. And part of it, the two other elements of the show were these people's lives were being broadcast back to Earth as a reality show called The Edge of Never. And if you actually go to YouTube, you can look up Edge of Never and you can see the commercial for the show that's on Fox that was the reality show in the show. And then also the people in the show had virtual reality goggles. They could have their own programs to keep themselves from being bored. And that's been suggested for years as a way to keep long duration space pioneers from going bonkers, is some kind of virtual reality to keep them occupied. So again, as far as getting the science right, that's still better than I would say than even Galactica. And it was a pretty good show. It was actually kind of disturbing too, about halfway through. Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the subtitle of the show, which is science fiction getting it right or wrong doesn't matter. And so I want to take the opposite tack here and ask the question, when science fiction does get it wrong, has that ever had a negative, do you feel that it does sometimes have a negative impact on society or in sociological views?
Seth and I were actually talking about this yesterday, and maybe not so much when you're dealing with faster-than-light travel, and things like that. I mean, those are misconceptions that can probably be corrected in a really humorous way, in the classroom, in talks and lectures and things like that. Where it really becomes a problem is on some of the medical shows. In my talk earlier today, I used the example of the anti-vaccine storyline in a series called Eli Stone a few years ago that was extremely controversial. People made health decisions based on what they saw on that TV show because it was so realistic. On some level, they forgot that it was fiction. They felt that because everything was recognizable, because they could relate to the characters, because it was life as they knew it, as opposed to some futuristic scientific world, that therefore there might be something to this anti-vax nonsense. And as a result, a lot of people did not get their children vaccinated. And I think that there's actually a case of epidemic of whooping cough that just broke out recently in California. It's a serious problem. Conversely, Hollywood Health and Society is another program at USC, and they actually they worked very closely with the writers of a soap opera. I think it was General Hospital, where they worked in a breast cancer storyline with one of the characters. And the awareness, and then they polled viewers before and after, and the awareness of breast cancer and the importance of mammograms and testing and regular testing went through the roof as a result of that show. So this is a tough question, because yes and no. What kind of show are we talking about? Sometimes it really, really matters. And other times, particularly with the futuristic sci-fi, you're just having fun. I think it depends on the genre, and it's very much a situational call.
I teach college astronomy. I teach roughly freshman level classes, and I think of all the disciplines, I think astronomy more so than most, there are ingrained, not stereotypes in the word, misconceptions that it's hard as hell to get out of people's head. And I was just pointing to a couple friends over here. I have a couple friends who are professors at University of Wyoming who study astronomical education and are experts in all those misconceptions. And it's as hard as it is to get these stereotypes out of people's heads and replace it with the actual information, which is tough. What we don't need is having popular sci-fi shows just reinforcing the things we're trying to beat out of them. Not physically beat out of them, though it's tempting. Sorry?
Like what?
Good example. Why do we have seasons? You ask why we have seasons to hundreds of even educated people, and you will get a consistent, same incorrect answer. Nothing to do with Earth's distance from the sun. It has to do with Earth's tilt and the duration of sunlight and the warming of sunlight, and actually, to a lesser extent, second order, the angle of sunlight, the flux. But yes, with people, it's a distance. And then I've had students. Okay, I tell them on the first day of class. For example, I said, this is hard. It's hard. You have a lot of misconceptions. For example, Earth's seasons are nothing to do with Earth's distance from the sun. Having said that, and I do this every class, having said that, there is somebody who is looking at me right now, and we'll go over this again in depth. Somebody looking at me right now will tell me on an exam that seasons are due to distance. Having just told you that, someone will still tell me that it's due to distance. And last term was my first term ever teaching where a student did not say that seasons are due to distance on an exam. So it was first ever. I gave him some extra credit. But it's tough. I give him collectively extra credit, which made me look like a nice guy, but really I did to them all, and it's curved. But that said, so we don't need to reinforce stereotypes when we're trying to be educators and trying to teach this is how the universe really operates. And then, of course, you get to Mars, and distance does make a difference. And then,
I was going to say, I think it's the touchstone you can use is whether the scientific information in question is practically useful to anybody. In this case, it's practically useful to students because that's their degree, that will be their career, hopefully. In the case of medicine, it's practically useful to people's lives. But say, for example, if we were a commonly spacefaring race and there were all sorts of misnomers about the way the airlocks worked, that would be deadly. But we're not, so that's not of particular practical importance to us right now. And I think that's, that's the way you can kind of test the water and imagine whether that particular piece of misinformation is going to have a negative impact.
we actually had a really cool airlock accident in virtuality. Airlock accidents can be really cool.
Okay, let's go back. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Can science find any kind of movie, which is attached to the space discovery, distort the human ability and sensitivity for the potential contact with unknown? I mean, like young student in a classroom, they see certain movie and they supposed to continue to develop certain ability, sensitivity, like working with satellite, working with computer, and certain movie, certain picture unconsciously may give you certain picture what you're supposed to do. They certainly push the intuition and other ability them given or knowledge for potential discovery in science. it's the movie have certain file for that, they have certain picture, we can do the contact this way, we do these certain things because we see this in a movie, I read this in a book, or
Am I right
something
in
like that.
thinking you're asking whether the way in which movies depict certain things, does that affect the way in which we then have to teach people?
Communication or science.
Right.
I think to do TV and cinema depictions of science and things with elements of science bias people's ability or conception of how it's actually done. Is that a so, I mean, if we watch Contact, is that how First Contact, or if we see a First Contact scenario when the Vulcans land with James Cromwell, and is that how First Contact is done? So I think that's kind of
I'd say absolutely, yeah. I mean, just in terms of small things like pieces of technology that have been imagined in science fiction and then end up existing, like that would be a bias, I guess.
A great example is the flip cell phone. Actually, the flip cell phone was designed to pattern the Star Trek communicator. But I don't know if that's actually what you're asking. I mean, do you think are you asking, could people get a preconceived notion of this is how you interact with the alien when you meet one?
If any sci-fi or sci-fi movie can destroy human ability and sensitivity, which might be developed in the future for the young student to continue develop certain knowledge and ability, like in science, radio technology.
Are you saying is film and television making us stupid?
If I may, paralyze your mind and thoughts and ability, put certain picture to you or to your mind, and continue to not develop certain way, feeling or intuition, and you just have certain picture what you follow, Don't develop your own ability and sensitivity for certain communication. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I've got this now. So you're asking whether if depictions of movies are too rigorous and accurate, whether you're just almost like programming people to act a certain way and to think a certain way.
First, space girls, I would like not maybe want to communicate with you if I know about thoughts and mind or about you.
Right. Wow, that's a really complex question.
Well, if the panel doesn't understand the question, then clearly you're at a level of sophistication that transcends the talents of those on the panel. So
there you have your answer.
So I'll suggest we go to another question. Do you have another question? We had a whole bunch. Yes, sir.
You talked earlier about, telling story in science fiction and that the science should enhance the story, maybe not necessarily be like the direct object or something of focus in a story. But I actually heard kind of the opposite yesterday, and I'll put it in Robert Sawyer's words. Just maybe you guys could discuss it, just because I know you guys want conflict. I mean, you guys want disagreement on the panel, so I'll throw something in there.
I'll take on Sawyer, no problem.
Bring it on.
I mean, he would agree with the saying that science serves the story, but he says when he goes through the process of coming up with a really good story, and I mean, it's obviously a credit to his work if he's winning awards that...
Every major prize, yeah.
Yeah, I heard him say it a lot of times. Anyways, he said, he focuses on a high concept or of science, like I think his direct word, like topical, is the science. That's what he's focusing on. And then his second objective is to create a character who's best at telling that story, not so much having these characters who can,
Yeah, I'm going to make a comment and then he's going to jump right in. I'm just going to say I was in one of Sawyer's sessions yesterday as well, the one in conversation with, and first of all, he writes novels, very, very different. You've got a lot more leeway to get into a lot more technical detail, and he writes novels specifically in the science fiction genre, which has a long history of really going into those kind of details. I do know a lot of people that will sometimes criticize science fiction because they are so focused on the science that their character and plots, their character development often leaves a little bit to be desired, even though the science is brilliant. So I know that he acknowledged that because one of the questions that was asked of him was what had been done to flash forward when it was made into a TV pilot. I personally saw the pilot and knew immediately it wasn't going to take off. Because the writing wasn't good and the characters were not compelling, even though the science was absolutely fascinating. And I was really rooting for it, but I knew that the storyline wasn't powerful enough for television to really capture the audience that it needed to stay on the air. And he did address that to a certain extent. He also acknowledged that the needs of television were very, very different from how he would approach the exact same story and topic in a novel. So I don't think there's any conflict there. I think Sawyer even understands that it's the needs of the genre and the medium that you're using. And I think Paul has something to add.
Yeah, this is just about different types of story writing, really. In terms of a sort of generalized theory of story writing, you could look at different types of storytelling as either plot-driven, character-driven, concept-driven. And I'm of a particular persuasion that I like character-driven plots. And I think if you have to manipulate a character around a plot point, that character tends, unless you're an incredibly skillful writer, to become less compelling because as a writer, you're not letting the character do anything spontaneous. And I hear a lot of writers say that sometimes their characters surprise them, and they tend to be the writers that I gravitate towards, the ones that let their characters live and breathe beyond the pre-constructed world that they've built around them. And just as a plug for my favourite science fiction writer, Ursula Le Guin, her work is all like that, her science fiction work. It's fantastic science, but it takes a sort of a slightly background role in that it supports the development of the characters and lets the characters breathe and do their own thing and interact and tell us things about our own social conditions, as well as our own scientific state of being.
And, and I think Sawyer at his best does that.
Yeah. Well, that's what I guess maybe might be confusing me a bit. I mean, I know it can.
Not read his work, so.
Yeah, I don't think he would see any conflict.
All right.
Kevin, do you want to weigh in, or you?
Yeah, I was going to say that to talk about the best writers, if you take a character and have to manipulate them, I think you'll find the characters will complain. Going back to what you said about a lot of writers will say their characters will tell them what they want to do. And a good example I know is on Babylon 5. Any fans?
Yes.
Okay. The plan was always to have Londo kill the Emperor, but Straczynski said as he was writing, Veer walked in and said, "Here, let me." And that's kind of how it looked, and how it played out. So the characters will tell you, if you listen to them, what they want to do. And like I said, if you're trying to manipulate them, they'll tell you they don't want to do that as well.
All right, let's go to, yes, sir.
So, I mean, we're worried about accuracy in science fiction, but, I mean, in general, entertainment does not do accuracy well. I mean, if you try to learn battle tactics from movies or history from Westerns, you're not going to do real well on what happens. The fact that we're concerned about this is admirable, but in general, anyone who's getting their reality from these media have serious problems. I mean, both in meeting up with other realities and with dealing with what's going to happen in the real world.
Excellent point. Why is science fiction different than other fictional narratives?
It's not a certain difference. We're just making an effort to get our genre right.
No. I say it's admirable, but in general, people don't want to see what's real.
I think that's actually true, which is why science fiction is so popular. They like the utopian, the futuristic worlds and things. But in order to build a plausible real world, you do need enough reality, so to speak, or a simulation of reality for people to buy into that world, because otherwise it's going to pull us out of the story. So when I talk about science being in service of the plot, of the story, that's another part of what I'm talking about. You're building a world. That world has to have rules. Those rules are going to be the physics, quote unquote, of that world. I mean, I wrote a book on the physics of the Buffyverse. Buffy the Vampire Slayer is not a science fiction show. It's pure fantasy. It has vampires and demons and one woman who can slay them all. And it's filled with magic. But when I looked at the rules that govern this fictional universe, for instance, there's a thermodynamics of magic in the Buffyverse. And they actually stated explicitly towards the end of the series that, magic works on physics, that you take energy from one spot and put it. They have a different kind of energy. They have a kind of energy we don't have access to, which is why they have phenomena that we would never in a million years. There's a rationality to it. Even though it's fun, it's fiction, and we're not taking it seriously. So it still comes down to finding that balance. We're not making documentaries here. We're not trying to get in the way of that. And you're right, someone who thinks that vampires really exist has much bigger problems than we can ever help them with. You know, opening a science textbook and getting the science right is not going to help that person. But, you know, drugs might help that person. Twilight. But I still think it makes for a better story if you pick and choose which science to really focus on and get right. It helps the willing suspension of disbelief. It helps create the illusion of your world, and that makes it a very powerful thing.
And Jennifer alluded to something that I think can't be emphasized too much, is that the mantra of a screenwriter is never break the audience from your dream. And with it, you know, there are a lot of technically literate people out there, especially look where we are sitting right here. And there are people who, if you get something that's easy to get right and correct, and I can go into endless places where that's happened, the person is transformed from somebody who's immersed in your vision, your universe, to somebody who's sitting in a room in the 21st century saying, hang on, and you've lost them. So if you want to engage this person as long as possible, get the easy stuff right.
And if you don't mind, I just want to try and unpackage an assumption in your question there. You said people don't want X or Y or Z. And I think this is something that's very prevalent within post large marketing company entertainment, is that entertainment is now trying to give people what they want, anticipate what they want. And this is my extreme idealism speaking here, but I think that entertainment should be giving people what creators want to give people, and people should be experiencing that. I don't think marketing should have a big role in the production and distribution of art, and it's frustrating that it does.
I agree, and my last point before I have to bail to catch a flight because my ride just showed up. On Battlestar, for example, I keep coming back to that, but it was wildly successful, and the thing is, the writers in the show were all extremely good at what they did, but at the same time, there was a single creative vision, Ron Moore and David Icke, on that show, we really were working on the show, doing a show that we would want to see. And Ron wanted to see, and then put out there for public consumption, and just turned out there were a lot of geeks like us. So yeah, the people really were. They were all grew up science fiction. You know, Jane, Ron, Bradley, all grew up big sci-fi fans, and doing the show we want to see, and that paid off really well, didn't it?
And it tends to. You know, when the take-off massively popular things tend to be things that the authors, they're writing what they want to do. They really believe in it, and people see that in the work. Yeah, absolutely.
Got a dash.
All right, other questions? People haven't asked questions? Let's see. Yes, sir.
Is there a concern in Hollywood for that the content of shows might contribute to the kind of dumbing down of the society? And I'm thinking of shows like X-Files that kind of conflate, you know, FBI work with utter fabulousness.
I don't think so, and I actually would disagree with that. I loved the X-Files, and it wasn't because I thought, wow, that's how the FBI really works. It got me thinking. It got me thinking about scientific mysteries. It got me Googling. It got me, investigating on my own and trying to ask, deeper questions and learn a little bit more. I think film and television at its best can do that, can inspire people to want to be. And now that we have the internet and anybody can Google it and look something up, it's pretty amazing. One of the things that we're talking about for the phase 2 of the Science and Entertainment Exchange is finding a way to systematize that, where we build in to the marketing for any program an educational component. So if there's an episode of Eureka or House that deals with a particular brand of science, we can have online on the actual main show's website some science behind tonight's episode. Were you curious about this? Click here. Were you curious about this? Click here. Here you can ask some questions of an actual scientist who's worked with people like this, the real-life Dr. House. What would you ask him? And make it interactive and engaging. I really don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think people understand when stuff is fiction. I know lawyers get really, really bent out of shape when they watch things like Ally McBeal and Law and Order because the legal the way law, legal precedents and courtroom drama is typically done is just not the way it would actually be. You're not allowed to give those big, long, dramatic speeches, for example. But people kind of instinctively know that. Most people who don't have mental problems can distinguish between reality and fiction. And I think it's more of an opportunity than a danger.
Yeah, furthering on that, I think there's a logical fallacy here that it's easy to fall into, and that's that if something is technically accurate, it will be educationally inspirational, and those two things don't necessarily follow each other. So, like you said, with the X-Files, it needn't be scientifically accurate to get someone asking those questions and finding the answers in legitimate places. I think the real danger here is entertainment for children. Because there is a real, and something that frustrates the hell out of me, pardon me, sorry, I'm English, I have an excuse. Something that really frustrates me is writing down to children, and that is a new phenomenon that I do think is dumbing down entertainment for kids and dumbing down literacy, because what would have been, take The Hobbit, the level of language in that is actually quite complex. And it takes something that's written for children, or not everything that's written for children, but the average children's book now. And there's this idea that they have to be, that the language has to be pitched at a lower level, when anybody who read as a kid knows that if there's a word you don't understand, you just intuit the meaning and then eventually figure it out by yourself. And that's a dangerous area, I think, and one in which your comment really kind of comes to bear.
I have to say that the one time when the number of inquiries at the SETI Institute went up was when the X-Files was on the air. Other questions? I can't see him.
Sorry.
Yeah, here.
Well, actually, I'm just going to riff on that X-Files thing because I thought I'd read right around the X-Files time that, the belief in pseudoscience just shot right up. And I guess my question is, okay, now we work on a project that's going to be, a global warming denial story, science fiction-wise. At some point, do you just sort of put your foot down and say, no, that's not science, that's sending the wrong message, that's going to have a bad effect on the science? Or do you work with it because it's just a story?
Again, slight caution here. There's a potential logical fallacy underlying, post hoc, propter hoc. Because X-Files came out, pseudoscience went up. I don't think that necessarily is the case. It may be that the X-Files reflected a certain kind of trend in society.
But we were just in a talk like an hour ago where it was people were just all through the room going, I've got kids that now, more kids than ever. So I guess you could say, you could take media off the line, but then we wouldn't be having this discussion if media didn't have any effect on people.
I don't think we're saying it doesn't have any effect. We're just not saying it has the direct effect that you're trying to draw. I don't think necessarily that the X-Files, for instance, resulted in more people believing in pseudoscience. I think they already were kind of prone that way, and the X-Files made them more aware of it. But is that the fault of Hollywood? I don't think so, not necessarily.
It's something that Hollywood can address, certainly, but not necessarily something that originated within Hollywood, perhaps.
But I do understand the concern, which I think is why the Exchange is looking at this phase 2 kind of thing, where you actually can partner with the studios and the people who are producing these shows and with educators in the scientific community to have that element and to kind of self-correct for some of that and give them kind of a one-stop shopping where they can actually read about, they can get excited about the science or whatever, or the fantasy or whatever in their fiction, but they can also then kind of probe more deeply and find out about some of the cool real-world stuff. I think over and over again we've seen that that particular model works incredibly well in outreach and science communication, and this is just a way to kind of make it reach more broadly.
Yes, sir. Oh, yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to go back to something you said about, House or another show, or Eureka. They can go on the internet and they can say, look here, look for the information there. And my only concern, and the internet has totally changed how schools work and how students study and how students learn. And I was very active in that a number of years ago because the science teacher had a number of us parents going on the web, going on the internet, checking out websites, because even though we know that some websites do give true information, and I'm using the word true not redundantly, but there are websites that give false information.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, there is the danger of the ostrich effect, where people will pick the sites that support their pre-existing conditions. I mean, yes, that's their cognitive bias always kicks in. That is something that we're going to need to really emphasize from here on out in our classrooms, teaching the students not just how to research online, but how to evaluate source material and figure out which is valid and which is not. And the other thing, that's another reason why in that Phase 2 program that we're trying to develop for the exchange, we want to do this in conjunction with educational organizations and teachers and actual scientists and work with the studios. We want to bring that credibility and authority to the material that shows up on the website for the show, which is the most likely place people are going to go first after watching that episode. So yes, we are aware of that problem. But again, that's a much bigger problem and not something that Hollywood alone can handle. It's got to be done across the board, and it's got to start in the classrooms.
Okay, maybe I can ask you, Jennifer. The National Academy of Sciences is, funding your lunches down there in Tinseltown.
No, I fund my own lunches.
What are their metrics? How do they know whether this endeavor is working?
Well, it's hard to measure. The only metric we can really reliably measure with any kind of objectivity is the number of queries that we do, and I can tell you that when we're really busy, we get 10 or 12 a week, which is actually quite a lot, because to match that many people up with the right scientist is extremely time-consuming. On a slow day, we might get 1 or 2, a slow week. So that's the only metric we can use. Whether it's effective, this is really hard to measure because we're talking about perceptions, we're talking about attitudes and ideas. And you can test for factual knowledge, which is what Hollywood Health and Society did with their breast cancer and soap opera project. But I think you would have a problem with TV shows. They were willing to do it once, but they didn't want to keep doing that because it interfered with their storytelling and with making their money. So yeah, that is an ongoing issue. I can tell you only anecdotally, through my 15, 20 years of working in science communication and the past 2 years working with Hollywood, that this strikes me as a model that works. Whether it's going to succeed long term, I mean, we're doing the experiment, and I think that we'll know in a few years whether this was worth 2 years of my life.
We have time for a couple more questions. Yes, sir.
Is there active resistance in Hollywood to actually getting the science right no matter what? Or is that just my perception?
There's some resistance. One of the things that we're trying to do is find the people who are most open to this. Yes, I think famously J.J. Abrams really would prefer not to talk to scientists. He's a little intimidated by them. He thinks they limit his creativity. We've had our partners, Janet and Jerry Zucker, speak with him and try and explain that no, science can actually help your stories. Red matter need never have happened. There could have been something that could have served the same plot point that would have not been so scientifically ridiculous. But it's really hard to argue with his success. He is currently the most bankable hot property right now in Hollywood. And until that, so he has no motivation to embrace science. He's behind Fringe. He helped create Lost. He's got the Star Trek franchise. He's got like 8 million other things he's working on. But he's also a rarity. You've also got people like James Cameron who cares deeply about getting the science right and creating a world. You've got people like Jamie Pollia, who Kevin Grazier works with on Eureka. Jamie's father is a scientist, and he worked for a while on a radio show that kind of interviewed scientists. He has a deep respect and appreciation for the culture. So what we're trying to do is find those people, put them in touch with more scientists, get them involved, build this community, and over time, they tell their friends, they bring their friends in, and this kind of spreads. And maybe one day we'll win over JJ.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, what is Hollywood trying to do? Are they trying to make more engineers and scientists?
They're just trying to make money by telling a really good story.
Okay.
And that's a very good point, because I do occasionally say this, and I haven't really made it as clear this particular weekend for whatever reason. Hollywood is a business, and it's not that they don't care about, contributing to a better world. It's not that they don't care about education and scientific literacy, but it's not their primary concern. I mean, it's bottom line. So essentially, they have to be able, you've got to sell it to them as saying, your product will be better as a result of this, and this will help you increase your bottom line and have great success. It's a win-win situation, and that's when they respond. The writers just love science for science sake, but you've got to also sell it to the producers and the studios who are putting up the bucks.
Yes?
From that perspective, then what's like the bar? Where does it become fantasy from science fiction? Like, you're clearly trying to protect the application of science.
I think the minute you try and set a bar or a particular boundary, you're kind of in trouble, because I think that, you know, you can speak to this, I think, a little bit as, you know, as a creative person.
It's just a line in the sand, really, and everyone's going to draw it at a different place.
Well, then what are like some red flags? I mean, obviously, like Star Wars is,
That's why
you
Star
can't
Wars,
tell.
That's
you
why
can't,
Star Wars was a long time ago.
Well, yeah, but you can't. I know. But I know. So
It's
you
already
can't. You
done.
can't.
The laws
you
of
can't,
physics did not apply.
I know. I know. You
I
can't
actually was
just
just
get a
talking to one of the guys who worked on the set. He worked on the special effects for Star Wars, and you know, they had a scientist there who was saying, you know, well, you know, that those fight scenes were, you know, aerodynamic in nature, which would not be possible in space. He goes, yeah, we based them on old World War II fighter pilot footage, because it looked cool. And he goes, and I gotta tell you, I mean, I actually met Neil Armstrong once, you know, it was a great moment of his life. And I asked him, did you like Star Wars? And this is a guy who knows what space is really like. He goes, I was on the edge of my seat. I was right there with you. You know, it didn't matter. It didn't matter. So it's dangerous to draw the line. If you do it really, really well, it doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, would your organization approach someone who's coming out with the next Star Wars type thing? It's going to be a great story. It's going to entertain people. People might not buy into any of the science of it, obviously, because there is no. So would you be that concerned with that movie, or what would you suggest?
We will sometimes, if we hear a project that's been announced, we'll sometimes like work our contacts and try and reach out to the director or the writer, or sometimes just the studio. You know, and we've built enough of a network that we can do that. Say, you know, we understand you're doing this, and you can wing it, and you'll probably do okay and make $1 million, but we can actually make it a better film, and it will still make $1 million, and you might actually, you know, end up with like an Oscar or something, you know, or become a classic, and you'll make your fans happy. You've got to sell it on that basis. It's funny because Neil deGrasse Tyson tells this very funny story about Titanic. You know, that scene after the ship is sunk and Rose is on the raft and she's looking up at the night sky. And it's the wrong night sky. I mean, and this is Jim Cameron, who went to great detail to like get the China pattern right for Titanic, and he missed the sky. And of course this bugs Tyson because he's an astronomer. He goes, look, we know the latitude, the longitude, the date, the time. We know exactly what that sky should look like. And he ran into Cameron and just wore him down. But what Jim said to him shut him up. You know, he says, yeah, he goes, that film only grossed about $160 million. Imagine how much more it would have grossed if I'd gotten the sky right. But when the director's cut DVD and Blu-ray came out, Neil got a call from Jim Cameron's assistant who said, I understand you have a sky for me. So if you look at the director's cut edition, the sky is correct. And I thank Neil deGrasse Tyson for letting me tell that story.
All right, well, lamentably, we are at the end of this hour, so I want to thank Paul Duffield for stepping into Andre Bormanis' shoes so admirably. And also Jennifer Ouellette, for whom this is her day job.